Forget New Year, New You. This season is about slowing down, locking the doors, and cozying up at home with the one you really want to do nothing with. Your dog. After the holiday chaos, those quiet nights with a blanket, a podcast, and your pup feel like the reset you actually need. Ollie helps make those moments easier with fresh protein-packed meals made from real human-grade ingredients, so your dog can enjoy some quality comfort food too. Choose from 5 recipes and get a personalized plan for your dog's needs. Meals arrive perfectly proportioned with a scoop and storage container, so serving is fast and mess-free. And with Ollie's in-app on-demand health screenings, supporting your dog is easy, ensuring more cuddles for many years to come. Visit ollie.com/truecrime and use code TRUECRIME for 60% off your first box.
Hey everyone, this is Jillian, and today I have a really exciting Court Junkie Brief for you on the topic of forensic psychology, with a specific focus on competency to stand trial and criminal responsibility. So, the majority of us have heard of some pretty well-known experts in the field of forensic psychology, perhaps most notably as experts in some high-profile cases that we have followed, such as Dr. Richard Samuels from the Jodi Arias case, or Dr. Frank DiCataldo from the Michelle Carter case. We know these names because these experts testified at trial on behalf of either the prosecution or the defense. But there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes with forensic psychology that we don't often get to see. For example, think about those cases in which the defendant's competency to stand trial is at issue, or a case where the defendant has pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Something that I have always wondered is, how is a defendant's competency determined? Enter the forensic psychologist. I had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Jennifer Johnson, who specializes in just that. First of all, Dr. Johnson, what is forensic psychology?
Basically, forensic psychology is an intersection between psychology and the law. So, a lot of the times when I mention to people about forensics, they're automatically like, oh, I like to watch CSI. And I'm like, that's cool, but I don't do any of that stuff. A lot of what I do is more education with the court, to be honest with you, because we go to, testify, we explain to the court about what is mental illness, what is criminal responsibility, what is competency, because a lot of these courts, these are questions that don't come up nearly as often as we think they do. And so a lot of these courts don't deal with mental health cases that often. So that's the biggest function that we serve is, we answer these questions for the court about how mental illness functions within the criminal justice system. And we always provide opinions. We don't provide ultimate opinions on anything. That is always up to the court. So we just kind of go, we educate, and we hope that, the best available outcome happens.
Dr. Johnson started out like a lot of us, with an interest in true crime and the way a human mind works. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got started in this field?
Well, it's really funny when, I do get that question a lot of, how did you even find out this existed? I mean, obviously true crime is a big thing now, so a lot more people know about forensic psychology, but when I was an undergrad, I remember I declared a psychology major pretty early. I've always loved people. I've always been fascinated of learning about people and why do they do what they do and those sorts of things. And then, of course, I always had my love of true crime. I had this weird obsession with Hitler that concerned my mom for a while. So it was mostly, this idea of how could this person do such atrocious things? Like, how are people capable of doing these things to another human being? And so I want to say it was my sophomore year, I was taking some criminology courses, actually, and I just remember, I think I was Googling or something, crime and psychology, and I found that forensic psychology was a field. And I was like, oh my God, it was like the whole world came together for me. And so I just kind of went from there, and it was just kind of like the perfect mix of the things that I enjoyed. And so I sought out programs, master's and then ultimately doctoral programs, that really would allow me to have the basis within psychology, but also obviously work within the forensic realm. And so there's not a lot of programs, but, there are definitely quite a few nowadays. My program that I went to was clinical psychology. So my degree is in clinical psychology, but all of my practicum placements involved forensics in some way, juvenile detention centers, probationers, forensic units on psychiatric hospitals, jails, that sort of thing. So I just kind of took myself from there, from kind of my love to it. And then once I knew this existed, I was kind of like, all right, where do I go? How do I sign up? So after I finished my doctorate, I did a postdoctoral fellowship in forensic psychology, which you don't always have to do a postdoctoral fellowship, but I do recommend it within forensic psychology. You can still do this without doing a formal postdoc, but it's an easy way to obviously your hours that you need to get licensed in psychology, but it also really helps you hone those skills, because then that's like all you're doing is forensic evaluation.
A good number of questions I asked Dr. Johnson were questions submitted by members of our Court Junkie discussion group on Facebook, as well as some questions of my own. First, I wanted to know what a day in the life of a forensic psychologist looks like. So let's talk a little bit about what you do specifically. So can you tell me what some of your job duties are and what a typical day for you is like?
Sure. So as far as my job duties, I kind of have two sections of my job. So one of them is as an outpatient forensic evaluator, which is what we call it. But basically that just means that I'm doing competency evaluations and criminal responsibility or not guilty by reason of insanity evaluations on an outpatient basis. So these are people who are in jail or on bond. So those are people that are just dealing with, their criminal charges, and they've been referred for an evaluation. But I also am an inpatient psychologist on a forensic unit. And so I work with individuals who have been sent to the hospital by the court, either because they're found not competent to stand trial. And so they're there to usually it's a combination of education about the court and medication. We do have individuals that, they don't need medication because they're not competent because of having an intellectual disability. But we do also obviously get a lot of people that have a mental illness and require some medication and some stabilization. So individuals who are not competent, and then also individuals who are found not guilty by reason of insanity by the court. So I'm a psychologist on the unit, and a lot of my job as far as the inpatient goes is helping the court figure out, okay, what do we do next? For the people, some people become competent, some people don't. So if they're competent, they go back to court and they deal with their charges. If they're found not competent and they cannot be restored to competency, which is kind of how we word it, which basically means either because they still have so many residual symptoms of psychosis that it's impeding their ability to learn about the court or function in court, or because they have such a, serious intellectual disability that they're not going to be able to learn it. Then they stay at the hospital and we kind of figure out, we'll do an assessment of risk and determine if they can be placed in the community and if so where, or if they need to stay at the hospital for additional treatment. So that's kind of the other part of my job.
Interesting. And what is the assessment of risk that you mentioned?
So you can do a lot of different things. There's a lot of different measures related to risk assessment, but basically within our program, it's a risk assessment to determine if you look at historical factors, things in their history. Do they have a history of violence? Do they have a history of not taking their medications? Do they have a history of trauma or those sorts of things that kind of, are identified as risk factors? You'll also look at their current presentation. How much insight do they have into their mental illness? How much understanding do they have of how their mental illness may relate to their violence risk? How are they functioning in the hospital currently? Do they have behavioral, cognitive, or emotional issues that you're noticing that are risky or concerning? And then you'll also look at in comparison to community, things that are offered in the community, can you appropriately manage these risks in the community? So are there available services? Is there adequate supervision? Those sorts of things we all kind of look at within the realm of, can this person be appropriately and safely managed in the community, both for their benefit and the benefit of the greater population, to determine if ultimately they are a danger to themselves or others, and if so, then they stay in the hospital, or if they can be managed, then we'll look at opportunities outside the hospital. But ultimately, like I said, that's a decision that's up to the judge. We make recommendations, but the judges are the ones who ultimately decide if they'll stay in the hospital or if they'll go.
I asked Dr. Johnson if she has ever disagreed with a judge's decision. She said yes, that happens, but explained why it's understandable when it does.
I think a lot of the times what happens is that we see it through kind of a more clinical lens. We know this person, we know risk factors, we kind of understand what the available resources are. a lot of the times what we see is that the courts, they're much more conservative, and maybe more conservative than we are at times, but they also just look at things differently. And, I've had cases where just because a person continues to exhibit mental health symptoms, the court says, well, they're not ready to be in the community, which honestly isn't realistic, especially for someone who has a lot of, delusions. Those don't generally go away with medication. A lot of that's still going to be there. Now, they might be more flexible. They might be more open to alternative possibilities. They might not be so responsive to those delusional beliefs, but to expect it to completely go away, for some people it does. But for some people it doesn't. So it kind of gets into that dicey area of, we see them as pretty well managed. They've been doing well in the hospital, but the court says, ugh, that's too much of a risk for me.
So what sort of evaluations do forensic psychologists use? So can you go over some of the evaluations that you guys use to determine a defendant's competence? Can you kind of walk me through how that process works?
So one of the most common that we do is an evaluation of competency to stand trial. And basically what that means is you want to assess whether this person seems like, whether they can function in court. So there are generally three parts. You're looking at, do they have a factual understanding of what's going on, which means do they know who people are in the courtroom? Do they know what their attorney's job is? Do they know what the prosecutor's job is? Do they know what the judge's job is? And so you kind of want to know, do they understand the basics? Do they know what they're charged with? Do they know what kind of sentence they're facing? Those sorts of things. Then you'll also look at the rational, which is what we call, which is basically their thinking. Can they make logical, can they make self-serving decisions for themselves? If a lot of the times it'll be things like, as far as plea bargaining, are they going to make decisions that are in their best interest, or are they so ill that they can't even make a decision? I've had cases where people have delusions that are specific either to court or to their case, and so their decision making is significantly impaired as far as what they want to do with their case. Like, I've had cases where the voice told them that they have to plead guilty, and so they just want to go in and plead guilty. It's like, well, okay. That is your right to plead guilty, but also if their decision-making is based on problems related to mental illness, then you want to be sure that you're treating that mental illness, and then so they can make their decision with a clear mind. So that can affect competency. And then the last part is their ability to work with their attorney. And sometimes this is an interesting one. I mean, obviously, we'll be able to determine a lot by, can they communicate with us? Can they talk with us about their case? Can they discuss things? Have they voiced any concerns or delusional beliefs about their attorney that could impact their conversations? And sometimes it gets iffy to where we'll call an attorney and just say, hey, I'm not asking you to break any confidentialities. I'm not asking you to tell me specifics. Can you just tell me, can you work with this person? Based on the time that you've spent with them, do you think you could work with them? And so it doesn't always come to that, but sometimes that's just the easiest way to get the answer to that question. And so really those three parts, the factual, the rational, and working with your attorney, those are part of competency. And again, like I said, it's just to be sure that they can go to court and that they can function without either causing problems for themselves or causing problems in court, without the mental illness affecting it. One of the other most common evaluations that we do is criminal responsibility, or what a lot of people know as a not guilty by reason of insanity plea. And what's important for people to know about this is that it's not something that everybody does. Actually, a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity or a referral for this evaluation happens in less than 1% of cases. So it's really, really uncommon, actually. So I know a lot of people, especially the news, they always get a lot of big, rep in the news, but it really is not very common. But anyway, so basically what we're looking at with criminal responsibility is, do they know the difference between right and wrong, or did they at the time of the crime? Did they know that could they appreciate the wrongfulness of their actions? And there is some variation across states. There's variation in all of this stuff within statute and all that to a certain extent. There are actually a few states, I know Idaho's one, I think there's one more, maybe two more, that don't actually have a not guilty by reason of insanity plea available. So some states don't even offer it. And then there's also some states where they'll look at beyond just the knowing right from wrong. They'll have what's called a volitional prong, which some people call the policeman at the elbow test. So if you had a policeman standing there literally at your elbow, would they still have done it? And a lot of the times people who are very mentally ill probably still would have done it. And so that's kind of, for some states, that's also something to consider. And so really you're just trying to get at how aware and how in control of themselves were they And so you'll look at a lot of things like, obviously, were they having mental health symptoms around that time? A lot of times witness statements or interviews are really helpful with that, because then you can also get other people, especially if someone was really mentally ill at the time and then they're on medication now and you're talking to them, they might not remember a whole lot, or they might not remember in ways that make sense. And so a lot of the times you'll try to piece that picture together from a lot of collateral information.
Dr. Johnson said the defendant's use of a substance can make the evaluations a little more complicated.
And, it does get dicey. It gets complicated. And I think one of the things that complicates it the most is substance use, because substance use in all states is considered a volitional act. And therefore, even if you didn't know the difference between right and wrong, if it's because you voluntarily use drugs or voluntarily drank alcohol to the point that, it affected those abilities, you can still be held criminally responsible. And so where it gets really dicey is when someone has mental health symptoms, but they also use drugs or drink alcohol. And so those, are really a case-by-case basis. You try to get as much collateral information as you can to answer those questions.
Risk assessments, which she spoke about earlier, are also used in their evaluations. As I was talking to Dr. Johnson, there was a scenario playing over in my mind that I wanted to ask her about. When a defendant is found not competent to stand trial, they're sent to a hospital where they work with forensic psychologists such as Dr. Johnson, and then as time goes by, their competency is restored. How and when is that determination made?
So we would do another evaluation. So generally what will happen, and obviously, again, every state is different, but generally you'll have an outpatient evaluation first. So someone might be seen in a jail or if they're on bond. And if they're determined that they're not competent, some states offer outpatient restoration where they can do it while they're living at home or on bond. And then other places you have to come into the hospital, or other cases, And so in the cases where they're in restoration, then every state is a little bit different, but there's generally a set time period where, let's say it's after 90 days, then they have to have another evaluation. And then that evaluation will get sent to court. If they're found competent then obviously they move on with their cases. If they continue to not be competent, sometimes the case will just be over if they're look, this person is very ill, or they have brain damage, or they are intellectually disabled, and it's not going to get any better, then they might be done at that point. They might not go through any more restoration. Other people might continue with the restoration process for another set period of time. Every statute is a little bit different, but however the statute sets it up of kind of, what they offer. As far as let's say it's a year. So they have a year to become competent. If at that time, you could do an evaluation earlier if you think they're ready. If not, you wait out that time, you do another evaluation and send it to the court, and then they kind of determine, okay, they are competent, or if they're not, then it's unlikely that they would be restored to competency.
So when someone is found not guilty by reason of insanity, what is the typical protocol as far as the follow-up is concerned with that?
Generally what happens, and I actually was talking to a couple of friends not too long ago, because I was trying to see, is it pretty normal across states? And it seems to be pretty consistent, both in the federal and a lot of the state systems, that when someone is found what we call NGRI, when someone is found NGRI, then they will be evaluated in some way, shape, or form, generally in the form of a risk assessment. And really that determines, do they need to be hospitalized, or can they be safe in the community? And so that evaluation then goes back to the court, and the court makes a determination of if they'll be committed to the hospital or if they will be transferred back into the community. They wouldn't just be released. There would be a process of, finding placement and, mental health treatment and those sorts of things. But I can't speak for all states, I don't know all 50, but in most states there's a process called conditional release. And so people who are found NGRI will be conditionally released, which means that they're allowed to be in the community as long as they follow these rules. And that's always going to include things like staying away from drugs and alcohol, taking their medications, participating in treatments, not missing appointments, those sorts of things. So they're still under the court's purview. There'll generally be some way of monitoring them to ensure that they are actually following those protocols. And if not, then they can be returned to the hospital at any point. And I know there are quite a few states where they will actually be on conditional release for the length of the maximum sentence for whatever their crime is. And so, like, it can be for a very long time if they get out of the hospital at all. We also have a lot of people that stay in the hospital for a very, very long time. And whether that's because they're stable or not, I mean, sometimes the courts kind of treat us as like an alternative prison. Well, if you're not going to go to prison, then, you know, you can stay in the hospital and until your sentence is up or that sort of thing. Nobody actually says that, but it's kind of treated similarly.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was going to ask if it was like an indefinite thing or if it, like how long that goes on.
Yeah, because ultimately the question is, you know, are they a danger to themselves or others?
Right.
And that's a decision, that's a legal decision as far as civil commitment goes. So that's ultimately up to the judges to determine if they are a danger. And so that'll be the court's decision. And it could ultimately be forever. You know, I've had quite a few cases where I'm trying to think if I've had someone that's come off conditional release. There might be one or two, but it's pretty rare. I mean, they like to keep an eye on everybody.
When they are on conditional release, is that like, do you have the same case as from when you initially did it? Or like, do you kind of follow them through that? Or do they use other people, like other forensic psychologists?
No, when someone is conditionally released, they'll generally be followed by someone in the community. So it wouldn't even necessarily be a forensic psychologist because they're not doing like assessments with them and stuff. A lot of the times they're like master's level treatment providers or some other version of like, you know, similar to functioning like a probation or parole officer.
So let's talk about juveniles versus adults. Are they in any ways treated any differently?
So I don't do juvenile evaluations, but I do have a few colleagues who do.
Okay.
And so I know a little bit about it. I think one of the biggest differences between people in juvenile court and adult court is kind of the way that the individuals are treated, the defendants are treated. Because juvenile court, there's a stronger emphasis on treatment and rehabilitation. You know, that's kind of the goal is that let's get these kids early. Okay, they're having some issues. What can we do to help them so that they don't end up being in adult court? And so one of the biggest things I think when assessing them is looking at like really there's a lot more focus on treatment. Like what do these kids need? What do they, and it's not that we don't do that in the adults, but I think that, you know, obviously the juvenile system functions a little bit differently. And so you're going to put a lot more emphasis on being very specific in recommendations for these kids. And especially since depending on their age, a lot of them are so dependent on the system that it's really going to be about what are you setting up around them. And so that's a big part of it. And then also, one thing that I've always thought was really interesting, but like I said, I don't do juvenile evaluations, so I can't speak too much about it, is that there are some states, now not all states, where you can actually consider maturity as a function within competency. So there are some states where you can actually say that they're not competent to face these charges because they're not mature enough, which I think is kind of an interesting notion. Like I said, I can't speak too much about it, but, you know, the idea that maybe they can't appreciate it to the full extent or you know, they can't really understand because of their, you know, immaturity, really the seriousness of it.
A good question from the discussion group, and one I was actually wondering myself. How does a forensic psychologist know whether or not they're being duped? Dr. Johnson's answer, I thought, was interesting.
You know, you could be a cynic, a skeptic, or you could just be open to the idea that, you know, that's always a possibility. There are plenty of people that I see that are perfectly genuine and perfectly, you know, honest. And there are also a number of people that I see that, you know, are just hoping they'll get away with something. You know, that's life. So I think that as a forensic psychologist, you always have to go in with that question of there's a possibility you can't trust the veracity of what they're saying. You try to corroborate what you can. And then also, you know, I mean, you can also oftentimes tell. Now, obviously, I don't read minds. I get people that ask me that as a psychologist. I do not read minds. But part of my job is noticing patterns and noticing consistency. And when I get someone who tells me that they don't know what a jury is or they don't know what a judge is, but then, you know, 30 minutes later, they're talking about when they were in court 2 years ago for this charge and the jury did this and the judge did this and blah, 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 blah. You can start to put those pieces together. And so you get a lot of people that they try on like a lower level to try and get away with stuff, but it's pretty hard to do, to be honest with you. And I've actually had it on both sides of it, where I've had people who try to pretend that they're psychotic. That's really hard to keep up. And it's also A lot of people don't know what are genuine mental health symptoms versus what aren't. There are a lot of things in television. I get annoyed when I watch some of these shows and I'm like, that's not a real mental health symptom. But at the same time, it kind of makes my job a lot easier because then people think those are genuine mental health symptoms. And so they'll bring them up in like these evaluations. And I'm like, well, okay, so I know that you're not being truthful about that. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. But I've actually also had a couple of cases. This is a little more rare, but I get, a couple of cases where it's not uncommon for someone who is mentally ill to not want to be seen as mentally ill. And so you'll get people who, like I said, it's not super common, but who are with it enough to know that they want to try and hide their symptoms. Maybe they've had people tell them that those thoughts are weird, or they've had people tell them, like, you're not supposed to be hearing those voices, or those sorts of things. And so they try to hide it, but that's just as hard to hide as it is to try and pretend that you're psychotic when you're not. And so really a lot of it is within the interview. There's a lot of parts and pieces, and I think experience goes a long way, where you start to kind of, like I said, you'll be able to recognize, what is a genuine mental health symptom, what isn't, what is pretty common and what isn't. You start to get kind of categories, I guess, or whatever kind of in your mind of generally what you expect to see. And when something seems off, you try to follow that rabbit hole and see where it goes.
Have you ever been afraid of a suspect before?
Good question. Especially during an evaluation, I've never been afraid someone was going to attack me, if that's kind of what you mean. I mean, I spend my days in a psychiatric hospital with people who are both stable and unstable. So that's, you always got your guard up there. And then there are certain things probably my best answer. I can't think of anyone specific, but I don't know. I think I'm a little numb to being in jails and whatnot, but I think it's just, you always have to have your guard up because you never know.
Right.
You just, no matter how well I get to know my patients, I still also know their histories. And so, not to be alone in a room with this one or you don't want to, you always want to make sure that a guard is nearby when you're evaluating this individual. So.
Have you ever assessed somebody and then regretted the outcome? And then if that is the case, what do you do in that scenario?
So I don't know if regret is the right way to word it. I think that what we function as a forensic psychologist, and especially when we do these evaluations and testify in court, is that we really are an unbiased party. And so we don't really have a stake in kind of what happens. And that's what I talked about earlier, how once I do the evaluation, I'm kind of done with it. It sounds cold, but really, I mean, that's kind of, you answer the court's question and that's the end of your function. You go to court, you might answer some questions, you'll educate, those sorts of things. But as far as what happens to the person after, that's up to the court. That's not up to you. I don't think regret's the right word. I do have some cases where what I've seen ultimately happens to individuals seems unfortunate. That's true for anyone. Maybe you feel like they're not getting the kind of mental health treatment that they need, or it seems like, we have some cases where I feel like someone's been in the hospital longer than they would have been if they had just gone ahead with their case. And so that is, sometimes unfortunate from that standpoint, but I don't know. I can't really say that I've regretted it because maybe it's just a healthy detachment from the court process. But yeah, our function is really just to be an educator and a third party objective party.
Here's another question from my discussion group. How do you balance the constant scientific advances in our understanding of mental illness with the seemingly static legal definitions of insanity and criminal responsibility?
Well, it's a really good question, but to be honest with you, I don't think it makes a big difference.
Okay.
Because really, it's not that it doesn't matter that we have scientific advancers or that we, have a new diagnostic statistical manual that comes out and calls, mental retardation intellectual disability now, or we called it different things. But the static legal definitions of things like insanity and criminal responsibility or competency, those don't really change because until some sort of Supreme Court, until the Supreme Court changes how we understand them, knowing the difference between right from wrong is kind of the crux of the issue, no matter what diagnosis you give them or no matter what, brain scan you give them or whatever it is. And so really, I think that what this question kind of brought up for me is really our function as forensic psychologists and as educators. Because one of the biggest functions that we serve instead of, when we answer these questions is we educate. So we come to court and we explain, okay, here's this understanding of mental illness, here's what that generally looks like, and here's how it affected their thinking, or here's how it affected their functioning or their understanding of the wrongfulness of their actions at this time. And so, like I said, I'm not sure that it really, I'm sure there are cases, of course, I hate absolutes as a psychologist. The best answer is always maybe. But, yeah, it's a really interesting question, but I'm not sure it really does make a big difference. Like I said, we might call something different. So it's like, okay, sorry, we don't call it substance abuse anymore. We call it substance use disorder. We explain the difference in how they broke down schizophrenia in a different way or these sorts of things. We explain those things, but a lot of the general picture doesn't change. Maybe you've got some brain scans that come in and show this or that, but you're still answering the same question of, did they know the difference between right from wrong? So again, it's kind of finding a new way to explain the same thing, I guess. But
so what are your thoughts on doing long-term studies into the psychology of those who commit violent crimes as opposed to just locking them away?
I like it. I want someone to do it. I'm sure plenty of people have tried. I haven't really come across too much stuff, but one of the things that really came to mind as you're saying this question is that my biggest question especially because you're thinking about like serial killers and all that, is, for one, serial killers are super rare. And so, that kind of thing, it's like, okay, it's good to learn these things. And, I know this new show, Mindhunter, like everyone's freaking out about how to figure out how to predict serial killers and all that. But, it's pretty rare. It's pretty difficult to kind of predict those things. And I think also for a lot of people who do a lot of the most heinous stuff that we're oftentimes as court junkies very interested in, they're also very psychopathic. And so, of course, your first question is, can I trust anything that's coming out of your mouth? Because if you're dealing with someone that's really high in psychopathy, they're generally not going to want to help you unless it serves some purpose for them. What good is it going to do for them? Like, they're probably not going to care about, whether or not you're catching other people. Now, obviously, there's different variations and different motivations maybe, but I wonder if that's part of the reason that we don't really have as much as we think we should, is because I think that it's for one, it's hard. I mean, we do have like risk assessments and those sorts of things where you're looking at the history of people who have committed these crimes and what seems to be common. And so that has gone into a lot of research as far as assessing risk. There's a lot of literature out there about assessment of risk.
Now, one sort of criticism that I've heard about the forensic psychology field in particular often arises when at trials we see a forensic psychologist testify for the prosecution saying one thing about the defendant and another one testifying for the defense saying something completely different. I brought this scenario up to Dr. Johnson to get her take on it.
I've had some cases that are a pretty close call, and I could see myself making a case for either side of it. And so I think in those cases, like, that would obviously make sense that I could see very easily how someone could come up with something different. And I do understand what you're saying about how, like, some people think that because people come up with such different opinions, then the field of psychology must be kind of like a joke, or it's not a science, or those sorts of things. But I think there are a couple of different factors that relate to that. The one I will address first, but I don't like, is that they're just like in any field, there are some people who, let's say, make a living out of providing their opinions. So sometimes, though not always, there are cases where there's some research out there about people that are kind of like more hired guns. They seem to always be providing testimony for one side, and they seem to serve that kind of function. And so, that could be one reason, which of course is the most jaded reason that I can think of. But I think what's more common than that is really that with psychology being a newer field, I think it is just generally under more scrutiny, but also, this is really no different than other fields. I mean, think about when you go to the doctor and they diagnose you with something, you get a second opinion and they diagnose you with something else. I mean, the fact is that you've got the same information in front of you where you're telling that doctor the same thing and they come up with something totally different. It could be based on education, could be based on background, could be based on experience. It could be any number of things. And it happens in a lot of different fields. I think this actually happens in the law a lot too. the law's all written in these books, and yet you'll get two attorneys that are arguing over the same sentence, but they interpret it two very different ways. And so I think it's actually not as uncommon as people think, but I think, like I said, because psychology does receive a lot of scrutiny, maybe because it's new, maybe because it's weird, maybe because it's different, I don't know, but I think that is a question that it's a good question, but it's also not actually as unique to psychology as we might think.
My last two questions were a little more lighthearted. Is there any trial that some of my listeners might be familiar with that you wish you could have been a part of?
I wouldn't say there's any of these horrible, nasty trials that I want to be a part of because, they get pretty rough. But there's a lot I'd like to sit there and watch. There's a lot that I would like to be in the room. I think it would be fascinating to be a spectator in the James Holmes case. I definitely think it would be fascinating to be a spectator in the Jodi Arias case. I think she's something else. And so I think that, I don't think that there's one that I've seen where I'm kind of like, ooh. I do think that I think there are quite a few of these people that I wouldn't mind having in a room and doing an assessment with, but I don't want it to be a part of court or trial. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
Like, just because they just seem like such fascinating or such, whatever they are kind of characters.
And do you find that you assess people in your everyday life when you're not at work?
I get people all the time when I tell them that I'm a psychologist. They're always like, "Are you reading my mind? Oh my God, are you judging me?" Like people automatically get super freaked out, and I'm like, "Look,
yeah, like what does your husband think?"
My husband is not very interested in my work. I tell him about it anyway, but yeah, no. I can say that I. You said, do you assess people in your everyday life? I don't do forensic assessment outside of work, that's for sure. But, being a psychologist, and especially being a forensic psychologist, like, you look at the world a little differently. I mean, that's just, and it's not that you're jaded or see crime everywhere. I just mean, like, it is my job to look at patterns of behavior. It's my job to assess and look for those little things that give you away even when you don't realize it. And it's not something you can just turn off, So it's like, yeah, I kind of understand more and more as I get more and more into my career. Like when people are like, "Can you read my mind?" It's like, well, no, but I noticed this, and I'm like, oh, that can be kind of creepy.
I wonder as your kids get older too, like when your kids hit the teenage years or something.
I was just gonna say that I have two daughters, and I feel like when they get old enough, like they start bringing partners home, it's going to be hard to not be like, ooh, that person's kind of creepy, or I don't like that one. You know what I mean? Like, that's just having a mom as a psychologist is going to get kind of rough. So, especially when it's my job to look for like risk factors and, these sorts of things like, well, tell me about it. Tell me about their family. Of course, if I'm going to apply it anywhere, it's going to be for the safety of my kids.
As we were wrapping up the interview, I asked Dr. Johnson if there was anything else she wanted to add. And there was, as far as misperceptions go.
First of all, not all forensic psychologists are profilers. I think profiling is very interesting, and I'd like to learn more about it, but I'm definitely not a profiler. I actually found the show Mindhunter really interesting because, I'm not a profiler. I don't function that way. Now, I think I actually don't think that differently from what I'm learning as far as, like, watching that show and kind of doing a little bit of reading. Like, I don't know that I think that differently from profilers, but it's definitely a different realm. It's not my job to catch serial killers and predict that sort of thing. So I can't predict all the school shooters and the serial killers. I wish I could. I'd be making a lot more money than I do now. One other thing that I feel like comes up a lot, and especially in my work where obviously I'm working with people who have either been convicted or charged with crimes, is that mental illness does not equate to violence. And I feel like this gets perpetuated again and again. And as soon as, you see a news story about someone attacked their partner or some random person at the mall, and they say, oh, well, they have a history of mental illness. And it's like all of a sudden everyone's like, oh my God, they were crazy, and that's it. And it really, it's kind of like saying that because some people who drink alcohol are violent, that anyone who drinks alcohol is violent. Like, I think anyone would think that was kind of ridiculous. And so it's the same thing with mental illness. Like, sure, just like drinking alcohol can affect your thinking and your behavior, so can a mental illness. But that doesn't mean that you're automatically going to start attacking people. And so it's just a lot more nuanced than that. I think a lot of people, it's easy for them to just make these quick jumps, and it's like, okay, well, we'll just lock up all the crazy people. Well, that's not really, for one, that's a civil rights issue, but also that's not really going to help the problem. That's not really going to help the issue. And then lastly, I feel like a lot of, maybe not a lot of the time, but it does seem to be fairly common where it gets the idea that when people are found not competent to stand trial or not guilty by reason of insanity, people seem to think that they just get off easy. And I'll tell you what, it's not easy. And I think what that does too is it kind of negates the importance of these legal questions. It really is about the fairness and the legality and the not violating people's rights, their due process, with making sure that they are competent to stand trial, and making sure that if they were not in control of themselves, or if they really didn't know the difference between right from wrong, that they're not held responsible in the same way. I think these really are important questions, and obviously given my work, there's something I'm more passionate about, but I get really frustrated when I hear people say, like, oh, they're just getting off easy. For one, I'll tell you what, I get some people that come to the hospital, and they're in the hospital a lot longer than they would have been in prison or jail. And so, like, sometimes it's not the easy road. And as far as major felonies, where they're facing a lot of time anyway, it can be a roll of the dice. They could be there for the rest of their lives, or they could, end up getting treatment and doing fine and going in the community. But that's where we go back to this question of, like, is hospital an alternative prison? Well, it's not supposed to function that way, but sometimes people want them to still do their time one place or another. And I certainly understand that mentality, but, that's not really meant to be the function of these legal questions. And so I think that's something that I wanted to be sure to talk about, is that you don't want to lose how important these things are as far as our due process, because it's easy when it's some, random mentally ill person that you don't know, but what if it was your brother or your sister or your mom or your dad, and you know that they're ill, and you know that they wouldn't have done that if they were on their medication or if they weren't sick, but they were, and they did it. So, when you can personalize it, and then you think, okay, now I kind of understand, like, maybe we don't just want to lock them up forever just because, you know what I mean? So.
And finally, from what I gathered in my Facebook discussion group, there's a lot of you out there who are interested in perhaps becoming a forensic psychologist yourself, or at least learning more about the field. So I asked Dr. Johnson where to start if you want to get involved in this profession. So if somebody wanted to get involved in this, where would you suggest that they, where would they go? How would they start?
I definitely think that you would want to get a doctorate. There are maybe one or two states that will allow you to do forensic evaluations at the master's level, but I think that's more out of necessity than, how do I want to word this? More out of necessity than necessarily like that what would be ideal. Because really, a doctorate level is what's expected in most states. And so, like I said, I personally, maybe it's just because it's what I did, but I would recommend a clinical program, because then you still have that full and well-rounded education in psychology. You learn about treatment, you learn about diagnostics, and those processes, but then you also, if you can find one with a forensic emphasis, then you'll also get the exposure to forensic populations. And, I've had some people in my program who realized they didn't really like forensics as much as they thought they would. And so like, it's, a good test for you, because then if nothing else, you've, got your degree, in clinical, and you could still go be a clinical psychologist, doing pretty much anything. So definitely looking at, doctorate programs, that look at forensics. And then I definitely recommend, like I said, the forensic psychology postdoc would be kind of, so as far as people getting started, I think definitely a doctorate, maybe a master's, there are masters in forensic psychology. There are also clinical masters that I think you can do some like clinical work within, jails, prisons, that sort of thing. So if people are just kind of want to test the waters, or they don't want to go for a doctorate because they have, any number of reasons, there are a lot of ways to get involved in the field. What I would say is that, you could do a master's in forensic psychology and still be able to do a lot within the field as far as working with inmates, working with probationers, that sort of thing. But if you want to do evaluation, If you want to do a lot more court testimony, if you want to do the not guilty by reason of insanity evaluations and competency evaluations, that sort of thing, you will need a doctorate.
And that's all for today's Court Junkie Brief. A special thank you to Dr. Johnson for taking the time to answer our questions. And a special thank you to Laura from the Fall Line podcast for introducing me to Dr. Johnson. If you're interested in discussing these kinds of topics or cases you've heard on this podcast or other cases in general, please consider joining our Facebook discussion group. Just go to courtjunkie.com/Facebook. You can also find me on Twitter at CourtJunkiePod, on Instagram at CourtJunkie, or you can email me at podcast@courtjunkie.com. To get early, ad-free access to Court Junkie episodes, you can donate as little as $1 a month to this podcast by going to courtjunkie.com/support. Thanks for listening. Until next time.